Commander stood at the observation window of Outpost and watched the sky turn black. The darkness was not natural. It moved and shifted like a living thing, spreading across the horizon like ink poured into water. She had seen this darkness before, 20 years ago on her home world. She had been the only survivor of her entire family. They were coming. Turned away from the window and looked at the tactical display in the center of the command room. Red markers covered the northern approach, each one representing a confirmed sighting. The count had stopped at 10,000 because the sensors could not process any more contacts. The true number was probably higher. Her communication officer, a young male named, looked up from his station with fear in his large eyes. "Commander, I have received responses from the Allied fleet." Already knew what those responses would say. She had sent emergency requests to every species in the coalition. 12 civilizations, hundreds of worlds, millions of ships. Surely someone would come to help defend the 2 million refugees sheltered in the outpost below. "Read them," she said. Swallowed hard. "The Meridian Collective sends their condolences. They recommend immediate evacuation." He paused. "The Empire expresses sympathy but cannot spare military resources for a defensive action against a confirmed swarm." Another pause. "The Assembly suggests we pray to whatever gods we believe in." Closed her eyes. She had expected this. They had been terrorizing the galaxy for 3,000 years. No species had ever successfully defended against a full swarm assault. The creatures fed on fear itself, projecting waves of psychic terror that paralyzed their victims before the slaughter began. The standard response to an attack was simple: run. Those who could not run died screaming. But there was no time to evacuate 2 million refugees. The transport ships would need at least 3 days to complete the process. They would arrive in less than 6 hours. "There is one more response," said quietly. "A human vessel has entered the system. They are requesting permission to dock." Opened her eyes. Humans. She knew little about them. They had joined the galactic community only 30 years ago, a young species from a small planet in an unremarkable solar system. They had proven themselves capable traders and decent engineers, but they had no significant military presence in this region of space. "How many ships?" she asked. Checked his display. "1 ship, Commander, a small transport vessel." 1 ship. Felt something between anger and despair. The humans had sent 1 ship to face 10,000. Either they did not understand the situation or they were mocking her. "They are requesting to speak with you directly," said. Their leader identifies herself as Captain Lisa Monroe of Earth Special Operations Command. Did not recognize the title. She authorized the communication link and watched as a human face appeared on her screen. The female had short brown hair and calm gray eyes. She wore simple military clothing with no decorations except a small patch on her shoulder showing some kind of blade. "Commander," the human said, "I understand you have a problem. My team is here to help." Studied the human carefully. There was no fear in her eyes, no tension in her voice. Either she was very brave or very foolish. "Captain Monroe, I appreciate the gesture, but I do not think you understand what we are facing. A swarm of over 10,000 is approaching this outpost. We have 2 million refugees who cannot be evacuated in time. Every allied species has refused to send military support because fighting thee is considered suicide." Captain Monroe nodded slowly. "I understand perfectly, Commander. That is exactly why we are here." "How many soldiers do you bring?" 47. Stared at the screen in silence. 47 humans against 10,000. The mathematics were not just unfavorable, they were absurd. "Captain Monroe, I mean no disrespect to your species, but 47 soldiers cannot make any meaningful difference against a swarm of this size. They will project their fear waves, and your people will be paralyzed within seconds. Then they will be torn apart." The human smiled slightly. "Commander, my team would like to see your defensive perimeter. With your permission, we will begin preparations immediately." Wanted to argue further, but she stopped herself. What difference did it make? In 6 hours, everyone in this outpost would likely be dead. If these humans wanted to throw their lives away in a futile gesture, she had no authority to stop them. "Permission granted," she said. "Dock at Base 7, I will have someone meet you there." The communication ended and turned back to the observation window. The darkness on the horizon had grown larger. She could almost hear the screaming, even though they were still hours away. Perhaps it was just her imagination. Perhaps it was the first whisper of their fear projection, reaching out across the void to announce their coming. She had survived one attack by hiding in a drainage pipe while her parents and siblings died above her. She had listened to their screams for 3 hours. She had felt the psychic terror pressing against her mind like a physical weight, trying to force her out of hiding, trying to make her join the slaughter. She would not hide this time. This time she would stand and fight, even if the fight was hopeless. The human transport ship arrived at Dock 7 exactly on schedule. Went down personally to meet them, curious to see what kind of soldiers would volunteer for a suicide mission. The ship's doors opened and the humans emerged in single file. They moved with a strange kind of smoothness, their eyes constantly scanning their surroundings, their hands never far from their weapons. They were different sizes and shapes, males and females, but they all shared the same expression. Calm, focused, alert. Captain Monroe approached and extended her hand in the human greeting gesture, had learned about this custom and accepted the handshake. "Thank you for allowing us to help, Commander," Monroe said. "I still do not understand why you came," replied. "Your own government must know this is a hopeless situation." Monroe's smile widened slightly. "Commander, there is something you should know about humans. We have a long history of fighting in hopeless situations. We have a word for soldiers who specialize in such fights. We call them special forces." She gestured to the soldiers behind her. "These men and women are the best our species has to offer. They have been trained to operate in conditions that would break ordinary soldiers. They have faced death so many times that they have learned to make friends with it." Looked at the humans again. They did not look particularly impressive. They were smaller than most warriors. They had no natural armor, no claws, no enhanced senses. But there was something in their eyes that made her scales tighten against her skin. Something cold and patient and utterly without mercy. "The Project Fear," she said. "They will reach into your minds and pull out your worst nightmares. Your soldiers will see things that will drive them mad." Captain Monroe nodded. "I know, that is exactly what we are counting on." Did not understand, but she was beginning to think that perhaps she had underestimated these strange creatures from Earth. The humans spread across the outpost like water flowing through cracks in stone. They moved quickly and efficiently, examining every corridor, every defensive position, every potential. Commander followed Captain Monroe through the main defensive line and watched the Special Forces soldiers work. A young human male named Lieutenant Park knelt beside the northern gate, planting small devices at precise intervals. Recognized them as explosive charges, but these were different from the standard military equipment she had seen before. They were smaller, more compact, and the human handled them with the casual ease of someone who had done this 1,000 times. "Your demolitions expert," said. Monroe nodded. "Has been blowing things up since he was 12 years old. His father was a mining engineer. He learned to shape explosions the way a sculptor shapes clay." Nearby, a human female was climbing to an elevated platform overlooking the main approach. She carried a long rifle with a scope that looked almost as large as her arm. She moved without sound, finding handholds that would never have noticed. "Sergeant Maria Santos," Monroe said. "She can hit a target from 2 kilometers away in complete darkness. She once held a position for 3 days without food or water because her team needed covering fire." Watched Santos settle into her position and begin adjusting her scope. The sniper moved with the patient precision of a predator waiting for prey. "Captain Monroe, I need to understand something," said. "The fear projection is not ordinary terror. It reaches directly into the mind and activates every fear response simultaneously. Soldiers do not just feel afraid. They experience their worst nightmares as if they were real. I have seen warriors who survived 100 battles collapse and weep like infants. I have seen them turn their weapons on themselves to escape the visions." Monroe stopped walking and turned to face directly. Her gray eyes held an expression that could not quite read. "Commander, what do you know about human history?" Considered the question. "Very little. Your species is young. You have only been traveling between stars for a few decades." "Before we reached the stars, we spent 100,000 years on our home world," Monroe said. "Earth is what your scientists would classify as a death world. Everything on our planet evolved to kill or be killed. Our oceans contain creatures with enough poison to kill 1,000 soldiers with a single bite. Our insects carry diseases that have wiped out millions. Our weather produces storms that can flatten cities and fires that burn across entire continents." She began walking again and followed. Humans evolved in the middle of all that death, Monroe continued. We were not the fastest animals. We were not the strongest. We had no armor, no venom, no natural weapons. What we had was fear. Tilted her head. Fear was your advantage. Fear kept us alive. Every human who has ever lived has experienced terror as a constant companion. We learned to listen to fear, to use it as a warning system. But we also learned something else. We learned that fear could be overcome. They reached the central command post where Master Sergeant Hayes was coordinating communication networks. The older human looked up from his equipment and gave Monroe a brief nod. "Comms are up, Captain. We have full coverage of the northern perimeter. The boys are ready." Monroe acknowledged him and turned back to. Our ancestors faced predators that could tear them apart with a single swipe. They had two choices, run or fight. Those who ran survived to pass on their genes, but so did those who fought through their fear and won. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Humans have been at war with fear itself since the dawn of our species. We have developed methods to manage terror, to function while terrified, to transform fear into something useful. We call it different things: courage, bravery, determination. But the truth is simpler. We are a species that learned to fight back against the voice in our heads that tells us to surrender. Was beginning to understand. And your special forces. The soldiers you see around you have been specifically selected and trained to operate at maximum effectiveness while experiencing extreme fear. They have been through programs designed to break them mentally and emotionally. They have faced simulated torture, mock executions, starvation, isolation, and sleep deprivation. They have learned to perform complex tasks while every nerve in their body screams at them to stop. Monroe gestured toward a group of soldiers checking their weapons near the eastern wall. These men and women do not ignore fear. They feel it as intensely as any other human, but they have learned to use it. When they are afraid, their senses sharpen. Their reaction times improve. Their focus becomes absolute. Fear does not paralyze them. It makes them more dangerous. Felt her scales shift with unease. She had spent her entire life believing that fear was the enemy, something to be avoided or suppressed. The idea that an entire species had evolved to weaponize terror was disturbing in ways she could not fully articulate. "They have fed on the fear of 1,000 species," she said. "They have perfected their psychic assault over 3,000 years. What makes you think your soldiers can resist something that has destroyed entire civilizations?" Monroe smiled, and this time there was no warmth in it. The project fear into the minds of their victims. They expect that fear to cause paralysis, surrender, and death. They have never encountered prey that responds to fear with increased aggression. She leaned closer too. When it tries to break a human with terror, the human does not collapse. The human gets angry. Every nightmare the projects, every trauma it awakens, every horror it reveals becomes fuel for rage. The fear does not go away, but it transforms into something they have never experienced. Stared at the human captain. What does it transform into? "Violence," Monroe said simply. "Pure, focused, unstoppable violence. The kind that does not care about pain or death or consequence. The kind that makes a human charge into certain death with a smile on their face because dying while fighting is better than dying while running." She straightened and looked toward the horizon, where the darkness continued to spread. They think they are predators. They think fear is their greatest weapon, but they have never hunted something that hunts back. They have never tried to terrify something that responds to terror by becoming more terrifying. Followed Monroe's gaze toward the approaching swarm. For the first time since the attack was announced, she felt something other than despair. It was not hope exactly. It was something stranger and darker. It was the beginning of understanding that perhaps the galaxy had been wrong about humans. Perhaps the quiet traders and friendly engineers from the small planet called Earth were hiding something in their blood, something ancient and savage and utterly without mercy. Perhaps they were about to learn why humanity had survived a death world. The sun set behind the mountains, and they descended from the poisoned sky like a wave of living nightmares. They came screaming, their voices carrying across kilometers of open ground, announcing their hunger to everything that could hear. Each creature was nearly 3 meters tall with black chitinous armor covering bodies that seemed designed by madness itself. Their limbs ended in claws that could tear through metal. Their faces had no eyes, only wide mouths filled with teeth that never stopped growing. Commander stood in the command center and watched her defensive lines collapse. The fear projection hit the Allied soldiers like a physical blow. Felt it herself, a sudden, overwhelming surge of terror that made her heart's race and her vision blur. Memories she had spent decades suppressing came flooding back. Her mother's screams, her father's blood on the walls, her siblings running toward deaths they could not escape. She gripped the edge of the tactical console and forced herself to breathe. She had trained for this. She had prepared herself mentally for years, but even with all her preparation, she could barely stay standing. Around her, soldiers were not as fortunate. Some collapsed to the floor and curled into protective positions, their minds overwhelmed by visions of their worst fears. Others dropped their weapons and ran, their discipline shattered by the psychic assault. A few turned their rifles on themselves, desperate to escape the nightmare that had invaded their thoughts. They advanced steadily, confident in their power, knowing that their prey would be paralyzed long before they arrived. Then the humans opened fire. The sound of human weapons cut through the screaming like thunder through rain, looked at her tactical display and saw something that made no sense. The human soldiers were not collapsing. They were not running. They were advancing. She switched the display to show the northern perimeter where Lieutenant Park had set his explosive charges. A wave was approaching their fear projection intensifying with every step. Park stood behind a barricade with a detonator in his hand, waiting. Even through the tactical camera, could see that Park was afraid. His hands trembled slightly. Sweat ran down his face. His breathing was rapid and shallow. The fear projection was affecting him just as it affected everyone else. But he did not run. He waited until they reached the optimal position, and then he pressed the trigger. The explosion tore through the front ranks of the swarm, sending broken bodies flying in every direction. Before the debris had finished falling, Park was already moving, repositioning to the next defensive point, his fear transformed into precise and deadly action. On the elevated platform, Sergeant Maria Santos was firing with mechanical precision. Each shot found its target, dropping one after another. Her scope showed her their horrific forms in perfect detail, their claws reaching toward her, their mouths opening to consume her flesh. The fear projection filled her mind with images of her own death, of her body being torn apart, of her final moments stretched into an eternity of agony. She kept firing. Captain Lisa Monroe led a team of 12 soldiers toward a breach in the eastern wall. They had broken through the Allied defensive line there, pouring into the outpost like a black tide. Monroe's team moved in formation, covering each other, communicating in short bursts of encrypted radio chatter. The fear projection intensified as they approached the breach. Monroe felt her childhood terrors rising from the depths of her memory. The car accident that had killed her brother, the hospital where she had watched her father die slowly from cancer, the training exercise where a malfunction had trapped her underwater for 3 minutes while she slowly drowned. She used each memory as fuel. The expected paralysis, they received grenades instead. Monroe's team swept through the breach with brutal efficiency, clearing each room, each corridor, each shadow where it might hide. Private First Class Amy, barely 22 years old, engaged in close combat when her rifle jammed. She pulled her combat knife and attacked the creature directly, finding gaps in its armor, her movements guided by training that had become pure instinct. It was larger, stronger, and faster. It had claws that could cut through steel and teeth that could crush bone. It projected terror directly into his mind, showing her visions of her own death repeated 1,000 times. Screamed and kept fighting. She took 3 wounds before she finally brought the creature down. Her blood mixed with the black ichor of the on the floor. She was immediately dragged to cover by Corporal Daniel, who applied a pressure bandage with one hand while firing his sidearm with the other. Commander watched all of this from the command center, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The humans were wounded. They were terrified. They were facing a force that outnumbered them by more than 200 to 1, and they were winning. Not winning exactly. That was too strong a word, but they were fighting. They were holding the line. They were doing something that no species had done against them in 3,000 years. They were making the demons pay for every meter of ground. Master Sergeant Hayes coordinated the defense from a mobile command position, his voice calm and steady despite the chaos around him. He directed fire teams to weak points, called for ammunition resupply, and tracked the movement of every human soldier on the battlefield. When a burst through his position, Hayes killed it with a shovel, not a weapon, a shovel he had found leaning against a supply crate. He swung it with both hands, the metal edge crushing the creature's skull before it could reach him. Then he picked up his radio and continued coordinating the defense as if nothing had happened. The assault faltered for the first time. The creatures had never encountered prey that fought back during the fear projection. Their entire evolutionary strategy depended on overwhelming terror that paralyzed their victims. But these humans were not paralyzed. They were angry. The swarm pulled back briefly, confused by this unexpected resistance. In that moment of hesitation, the humans pressed forward. It was not a counterattack in any traditional sense. There were not enough of them for that. But they moved aggressively, taking ground, establishing new defensive positions, forcing them to face them directly rather than overwhelming the collapsed Allied lines. Captain Monroe found in the command center an hour after the first assault. The human was covered in blood, most of it black, some of it red. Her left arm hung at an odd angle, clearly broken. She had not stopped to get it treated. "We are holding," Monroe said, "but we need your surviving soldiers to reform the defensive line. Can you get them back on their feet?" Looked at the troops scattered around the command center. Most of them had recovered from the initial psychic assault, though their eyes still held the haunted look of beings who had seen too much. "I can try," she said, "but they saw what happened. They felt the fear projection. How do we ask them to face that again?" Monroe's gray eyes met hers. "Show them what we show them that fear can be defeated, not ignored, not suppressed, defeated. Let them see that the monsters bleed and die like anything else." She turned and walked back toward the fighting, her broken arm swinging uselessly at her side, her rifle held steady in her remaining good hand. Watched her go and felt something shift inside her. It was not courage exactly. It was something older and more primitive. It was the realization that she had a choice. She could die cowering in a command center, or she could die fighting alongside the strange creatures from Earth. She picked up a rifle and followed Captain Monroe into the darkness. The swarm communicated through a shared consciousness that connected every creature in the hive. What one saw, all knew. What one felt, all experienced. This connection had made them the perfect predators for 3,000 years. They could coordinate attacks across kilometers of battlefield, adjusting their strategy in real time, overwhelming their prey with precision that no ordinary army could match. Now that connection was spreading something new through the hive, something that had never existed in consciousness before. Doubt. The small creatures were not dying properly. They felt the fear projection. The hive could sense their terror through the psychic link, could taste the nightmares that filled their minds, could feel the racing of their hearts and the trembling of their bodies. But instead of surrendering to that terror, the creatures were becoming more dangerous. A warrior approached a human position from the eastern flank. It projected maximum fear intensity, flooding the human's mind with images of death and suffering. The human, a female with dark hair and blood running down her face, looked directly at thee and smiled. Then she shot it 3 times in the chest. The death rippled through the hive consciousness, carrying with it the final experience of that warrior: confusion, pain, and something that felt disturbingly like fear. Across the battlefield, similar experiences were multiplying. Warriors who had fed on the terror of 1,000 species were encountering prey that refused to be prey. The humans did not fight like cornered animals. They fought like predators, like hunters, like creatures who had decided that death was acceptable as long as they took their enemies with them. Staff Sergeant Roberto Vega led a flanking maneuver through the western approach. His team of 8 soldiers moved through terrain that they considered secure, finding paths between the creatures, striking from unexpected angles, and disappearing before the swarm could respond. Vega was experiencing his own personal hell. The fear projection showed him the faces of the soldiers he had lost in previous missions, young men and women who had died under his command, whose families he had visited to deliver the worst news of their lives. He saw their eyes accusing him, blaming him, asking why he had survived when they had not. He used the guilt as fuel. His team killed 43 in 17 minutes before withdrawing to a secondary position. They left behind traps that killed another 22. Vega did not count the bodies. He was already planning the next attack. Sergeant First Class was holding a defensive position near the refugee shelters when they made their most concentrated push. A wave of over 500 creatures descended on her position, their fear projection focused to maximum intensity. had spent 20 years in special forces. She had been captured once, held for 6 weeks, and subjected to interrogation techniques that would have broken most people within days. She had escaped by killing her guards with a piece of wire she had hidden in her mouth. They showed her those 6 weeks in vivid detail. They showed her the room where she had been held, the faces of her captors, the pain that had become her constant companion. They showed her the moment she had almost given up, the moment she had considered ending her own life to escape the suffering. Remembered what happened after that moment. She remembered the cold determination that had replaced the despair. She remembered the feeling of wire cutting through flesh. She remembered the sound of her captors dying one by one. She stood up from her cover and walked toward them with her rifle firing on automatic. The other soldiers on the line watched in disbelief as advanced into the swarm. She was screaming something, words that might have been a battle cry or might have been a prayer. Fell around her, cut down by precise bursts of fire. When her rifle ran empty, she drew her sidearm. When her sidearm ran empty, she drew her knife. A claw caught her in the shoulder, spinning her around and dropping her to one knee. She stabbed the creature in the throat and kept moving forward. The line broke. Not because they were defeated. They still outnumbered the humans by massive margins. They broke because they had never seen anything like this. Their fear projection was working. They could feel the terror in its mind, could taste her nightmares, could sense the memories that haunted her. But instead of paralyzing her, the terror seemed to be driving her forward. The hive consciousness struggled to process this information. Prey did not behave this way. Prey cowered. Prey surrendered. Prey died quietly or died screaming, but prey did not charge into certain death with apparent joy. Something was wrong with these creatures. Captain Lisa Monroe received a field medical treatment for her broken arm that consisted of a splint made from rifle parts and enough painkillers to keep her functional. She returned to the fighting within 20 minutes, coordinating her remaining soldiers with the precision of someone who had commanded troops in a dozen impossible situations. The Allied soldiers who had recovered from the initial assault were beginning to rejoin the fight. Commander led a group of 30 warriors to reinforce the human positions. They had watched the humans fight and had seen something that changed their understanding of combat itself. Fear could be overcome, not through absence of feeling but through transformation of feeling. The humans were not brave in the sense that understood bravery. They were not without fear. They were afraid and fighting anyway, using their terror as a weapon rather than a weakness. Found Captain Monroe on a rooftop overlooking the main battle. The human was directing fire teams with her radio while simultaneously providing sniper support with a captured weapon. "Your people are dying," said. Monroe nodded without taking her eyes off the battlefield. "I know. But you keep fighting." "We always keep fighting." Monroe fired twice, dropping a that had been approaching the refugee shelters. "That is what we do. That is what we have always done." She finally turned to look at. Her gray eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, pain, and something else. Something that looked almost like peace. "Humans learned a long time ago that death is not the worst thing that can happen to you," Monroe said. "The worst thing is living without meaning, living without purpose. We are here because these refugees need protection. We are here because someone has to stand against the darkness. If we die doing that, we die as ourselves. We die as humans. That is enough." Below them, the battle continued. They were pulling back across multiple fronts, not retreating exactly, but regrouping. They were trying to understand these new enemies, trying to find weaknesses that their fear projection could exploit. They were learning that the humans had no such weaknesses. Every fear they awakened became a source of strength. Every nightmare they projected became motivation for violence. The humans did not fight despite their terror. They fought because of it. The swarm began to feel something spreading through its collective consciousness. It was a new sensation, unfamiliar and deeply disturbing. They were becoming afraid. Dawn came slowly too, painting the sky in shades of red and gold that seemed almost mocking after a night of such darkness. The battlefield was covered in bodies, most of them black and chitinous, some of them smaller and dressed in human military equipment. The swarm had fled 2 hours before sunrise. Over 7,000 creatures had retreated toward the horizon at speeds that the hive had never achieved before. They ran from 47 humans. They ran from prey that had become predators. Commander walked through the aftermath of the battle in a state of shock. She had fought through the night alongside the human soldiers. She had killed her first with a blade when her rifle ran out of ammunition. She had felt the fear projection trying to break her mind, and she had pushed through it by watching what the humans did. They had shown her that terror was not an end, it was a beginning. 17 humans had died during the fighting. Every survivor was wounded. Sergeant Maria Santos had taken a claw through her abdomen and had continued sniping for another 4 hours before collapsing from blood loss. Lieutenant Park had burns covering 30% of his body from an explosion he had triggered while standing too close. Master Sergeant Hayes had lost 2 fingers on his left hand and had not mentioned it to anyone until the battle was over. Captain Lisa Monroe sat on a pile of rubble near the eastern gate, her broken arm now properly splinted, her face pale from exhaustion and medication. A medic was stitching a wound on her forehead while she reviewed casualty reports on a tablet. Approached her and stood in silence for a moment, searching for words that seemed inadequate to express what she had witnessed. "How," she finally asked, "how did 47 of you defeat 10,000? Monroe looked up from her tablet. Her gray eyes were tired but clear. "We did not defeat them, Commander. We taught them something new. They have spent 3,000 years as apex predators. They evolved to use fear as a weapon because they never developed other hunting strategies. They never needed to. Every species they encountered was paralyzed by their psychic assault. They have never faced prey that fights harder when afraid." She set down the tablet and gestured toward the horizon where the swarm had disappeared. "Humans evolved on a death world surrounded by predators that were faster, stronger, and deadlier than us. We survived not by being the most powerful but by being the most adaptable. We learned to use every resource available to us, including our own terror. Fear became a tool. Adrenaline became a weapon. The instinct to survive transformed into the willingness to fight regardless of odds. Consider this. Your special forces, they are all like this. Special forces are humans who have been specifically selected and trained to perform at peak effectiveness while experiencing maximum psychological stress. They represent the extreme end of human capability, but every human carries this potential within them. We are a species that has been at war with our own fears since the first of our ancestors stood up on 2 legs and decided to fight back against the darkness. A medical shuttle landed nearby, and wounded soldiers began the process of evacuation to better facilities. Watched Staff Sergeant Roberto Vega helping a younger soldier onto a stretcher despite his own wounds, refusing treatment until his team was taken care of. "The will return," said, "they always return." Monroe nodded. "Probably, but they will not be the same. They have experienced something that will change them forever. They have learned that fear can be turned against them. They have learned that some prey fights back. That knowledge will spread through their hive consciousness and alter how they approach future hunts." She stood up slowly, wincing at the pain in her arm. "More importantly, the galaxy has learned something too. They are not invincible. They can be fought. They can be hurt. They can be made to flee. For 3,000 years, every species has believed that running was the only option. Now they know that standing and fighting is possible." Thought about the 2 million refugees sheltered below the outpost. They were alive because 47 humans had chosen to face a nightmare that entire civilizations had fled from. They were alive because those humans had transformed their terror into something they had never encountered. "What happens now?" asked. Monroe smiled slightly. "Now we rest, we recover, we honor our dead and treat our wounded, and then we go back to Earth and train more soldiers, because this will not be the last time someone needs help against impossible odds." She began walking toward the medical station, then paused and turned back. "Commander, the galaxy has been afraid of the wrong things. They feed on fear because they have never experienced it themselves. They do not understand that fear can be a source of strength. They do not know that some creatures in the universe have learned to transform terror into rage, panic into precision, the desire to flee into the determination to stand." Her gray eyes held in place. "Humans called us special forces because we specialize in situations that seem hopeless. But the truth is simpler than that. We are what happens when a species spends 100,000 years fighting against its own survival instincts. We are what happens when fear becomes fuel." She turned and walked away, leaving alone with the rising sun and the bodies of fallen. 3 days later, a survivor reached the core of its hive consciousness, carrying the memories of the battle at. Those memories spread through every connected in the galaxy, reaching swarms on 1,000 worlds within hours. The hive mind processed the information with growing unease. The small creatures called humans had not simply resisted the fear projection. They had used it. Every nightmare the swarm had projected had become motivation for violence. Every trauma they had awakened had transformed into focused aggression. The humans had taken this greatest weapon and turned it against them. The hive mind reached a conclusion that no had ever contemplated before. Some prey should not be hunted. The humans called them special forces. They were soldiers trained to fight in impossible situations, to function while terrified, to transform fear into something that even demons should fear. They had spent 3,000 years believing they were the ultimate predators in the galaxy. They had fed on the terror of countless species, growing stronger with each conquest. They had never encountered a species that fed on its own terror. They had never faced creatures that became more dangerous when afraid. They had never known that some beings in the universe had been fighting against fear itself since the dawn of their existence. The hive mind added a new concept to its collective knowledge, a warning that would spread to every swarm for generations to come. Avoid the death world called Earth. Avoid the creatures who call themselves humans. Avoid the soldiers who transform nightmares into weapons. For the first time in 3,000 years, the hunters had become the hunted. And somewhere in the vastness of space, 47 humans had taught the galaxy that fear was not an end. It was only the beginning.